Hi, Lou Pulsfer here to talk about essentially where game ideas come from. In particular, I want to talk about inspiration. Now, you may have heard of Glenn Cook. He's written dozens of science fiction and fantasy novels, writing many of them while working full-time on a General Motors assembly line. He was asked how he came up with stories. He borrowed a phrase from Salman Rushdie. He found them in the sea of stories, quote unquote. Cook said that by the time he finished one story, he knew what the next one would be. Now this is an extreme of a continuum where he was relying very heavily on inspiration. Now when he actually wrote the story, he still had to put a lot of work into it, but for where the stories came from, he was relying heavily on inspiration. Now let's translate this to games. Some game designers work serially. They work on a game, they finish it or give up on it, then they work on the next game. They work on one at a time. Many, and certainly I count myself amongst these, work on many in parallel, 20 a year in my case, which means ultimately that I reject many of them. I don't know where some of the ideas for my games have come from, even though I write extensive notes when I get an idea. For most of them I can tell you the original ideas and even show you the notes, but I can't explain exactly where they came from. So at that point I have to say they came from the sea of games. Now, novelists perhaps rely more on ideas than game designers do. And most novelists say they have far more ideas than they can possibly write. The one thing I know for certain, you have to work at getting ideas for games, or you'll have relatively few. Now this is a diagram to try to show what's involved in making games. Glenn Cook, at least when he started things, was way over on the inspiration side. But in general, on average I would say, we're where the red circle is, where it's much more perspiration and inspiration. But of course your mileage may vary. I think that you need a reliable method when inspiration is not available. Now Leonard Bernstein, who was a very famous conductor, composer, and writer about classical music, who transcended his field and became a national celebrity, said, quote, "Inspiration is wonderful when it happens, but the writer must develop an approach for the rest of the time. The wait is too long." Unquote. And the same thing applies to games. For me, game design is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Now I'm paraphrasing Thomas Edison, who set the inspiration at only 1% for his inventions. But I think Edison probably used a trial and error method a little too much instead of having some other reliable method. He was just guessing, tried a whole lot of things, and succeeded. If you work at getting ideas for games, you'll get lots of them, and some of them will work out. But always remember, the ideas, where the games come from, are only a start. Whether you get them in some organized manner or they just pop up from the sea of games. So, to me, much of game design is like engineering or project management. You need a solid method. You can't rely on trial and error or guess and check. Writing a novel is entirely solitary, so there may be more inspiration involved than in game design and development. But you have to do something other than just trial and error or rely on intuition or rely on inspiration, because those are not reliable methods. I certainly hope that you have good access to the sea of games, but you can't depend on it if you want to be a professional designer. Thanks for listening.